Then I can figure that out later. All right, looks like we are in record mode. All right, so as soon as you open Delta, it's going to recall the last few tabs that you had open. I'm going to go ahead and close those for now. I'm going to start with this layout here, this root here, this documents directory. This documents directory points directly to the location that was set during the installation. All of the files that you create within the Delta translator first exist on the local machine. So we can go here and actually see that. From the documents directory, you see there's a couple subdirectories and then they go into others as well. Well, in fact, that is actually represented here under the tree. And I do like to structure my data in such a way that it's clear to me, because this information, when I go to the map organizer, you'll see that it persists even when installed to ECS, the ECS environment, and then it in turn is easier to locate what you need. In fact, if I go to my desktop here for a moment, and I'll open up my environment, you can see I have under professional services here, I have per client that I work with, and then I have, you know, their particular transactions that are related here. So I'd always encourage this type of organization. I do see sometimes where everything is dumped into the documents directory and you just have maps and models all throughout, and sometimes that's challenging to work through. So that's just a note as far as organizationally what seems to work best. Any type of organizational structure that you wish to create here will dynamically update itself on the file system. So I can create a new folder here, and we can call this, let's say we're trading with Amazon. I'm going to create an Amazon folder, and then within that folder, I'll create the folders that represent the various transaction sets that perhaps I'll be receiving or creating. Upon doing that, you can see here, we'll go to documents, that again, the Amazon folder and subdirectories are dynamically created on the file system as well. So once I have a sense of organization, then I begin to look to the next step, which is to create a model. A model is a representation of the data that you'll be receiving for translation and the resulting output of that translation. And if you go to the File New menu option, you'll see the various model types that we support. Basically, we support the modeling of any data that is structured in some way. Now, that can be challenging in some ways. Some things might look structured, but in fact, they are not. There is this concept of a text document. A text document is useful only for creating things like email messages that are embedded in the body of an email message. I've seen some people use this for creating HTML-based reports, so they can create HTML tables, add some colorful captions, and then they can actually map data into those tables that they can then either email out or perhaps drop in a directory, which is then referenced by an internal website. We'll look at that in a bit here, but I'll start going through the more common ones and to give you a sense of the what to prepare for. So I will definitely just start here with the EDI document type. Now, most of these allow you to generate a model based on a sample file that you're given, as well as a definition file of some sort. And then, of course, creating something from scratch. Within an EDI environment here, we have the ability, again, to create something from scratch. So I can actually select a file from a repository or from a directory. In fact, we can go right here to the project resources here, and excuse me, we're going to go to the number 2, the mapping demo. Here we have resources, and nope, no EDI file there. Where am I headed? Let me see here. I betcha if we do this. Let's see. Okay, I'm in my student directory. I'm going to go to my desktop, and then I'm going to go to instructor files and mapping demo, and let's see if we have it there. So give me a minute to find what we did. Let's see, mapping demo. I thought we had a sample in there. Take a quick look for a minute here. Yeah, the student level, instructor level. I guess we're asking you in the mapping demo. Okay, looks like that was, in this case, we're asking you to actually build that from scratch. Okay, so I'm going to back out here. So instead, I'm going to go to EDI document to find a sample file. I'm actually going to go to the instructor file, and let's go straight to blue. And I believe samples is where those are. I can create point to that particular sample file .edi extension and hit finish. And what this does is it will bring up a new tab with the representation of every segment that's available under the dictionary. In this case, it's 4030 of the transaction set that I am modeling. Now, based on what the sample contained, checks are marked in the boxes that correspond with the data that was in the sample itself. So if I expand now the BEG, I know the sample included the BEG 1, 2, 3, and 5. So if I go into that segment node itself, it has the actual segment name. You can make a note here if you wish related to this particular segment that might be important to communicate to a trading partner, because in a minute I'm going to show you how you can create a specification off of the structure. And then we have this concept of object instancing. So within an EDI transaction, we can see here if we have one handy. There are some segments that repeat. So in this case here, we have an N1, which represents address information, and you can have different blocks of addresses. In this case, we have the buying party and then the ship to party represented here. I could come along within the model itself if I wanted to, and I can create a separate instance for each one of those N1 segment. It's not required, and I rarely do that myself, because you'll see within the mapping how you can do that dynamically within the map itself. But sometimes you can, it's important for you to make that reference, because I'll show you this. If I go to the REF here, generate an instance, and let's, because the REF01 is where I keep my identification information that identifies a unique REF segment, I can say, okay, here's my REF01 or REF segment where the REF01 is equal to IA. So this is my vendor segment, I can say, my internal vendor segment. And you can actually see here where we've added some reference to it. I'm going to right click and create insert an instance. And I've essentially duplicated the REF segment. And this time I'm going to select the vendor order number ID that will live in the REF01. That in turn gives me a second reference. So I have two segment representations in order to illustrate different uses of that REF. Again, when I map, I really don't need to do that. I don't have to create a separate instance every time I anticipate one. This, however, is very useful if I want to print what I've just created here. And if you go to File and Print Preview, you can see a specification that represents the model that we created. So the very high level, we have header information and detail information. We have the segments represented per each. And then as I dig into the body here, into the detail, you'll see here's the original BEG, the CUR, and then we get into the REF. So here's my REF segment representation 1 for IA and representation 2 for VN. It's really visually organizing, and it's something that you can incorporate here. And then you can even see the BEG notes that I had keyed in earlier and how that sits within the structure. So it's a nice way to document this if you're exchanging information with a trading partner. Also internally, you may be hit with a requirement to provide some documentation of these maps. And the easiest way to do that is to open up a model. You can open up the map even and do a print, save it to PDF, save it as a PDF, and then essentially you're done. So I'm going to hit close here, and we'll return to the segment. So overall, we have this object which represents the transaction set. We have the multiple segments, and then under each segment we have individual elements. And then the elements themselves, they're predefined as far as data type and character width, max length, min length, because that's already predefined in X12 dictionaries. This model reads from the dictionary and pre-populates all this information for you. Now, in some cases, depending on your segment type, there may be predefined codes related to that particular element. In this case, there is, and based on the sample I received, only 00 was included. You're welcome to add multiple types of IDs. Using this checkbox, you can quickly see what subset may exist. And you could set this ahead of time. And what this does is during the mapping process, it restricts you to mapping these particular values for the BEG01. And that can be helpful when sometimes I've seen where one person is in charge of just creating these models, and then they will load up all of this, these subsets of IDs, make all the confirmation as far as segments and element usage, and then someone else will come in and take those models and then create a map from it. So when you're sharing that kind of responsibility, that might be helpful to do. And again, you have, a generic notes field. What's also helpful is you can use your space bar to activate. Well, you used to be able to. Let me see if this is that no longer the case? Yeah, that does no longer exist. There once was a time when you could use your space bar to select and deselect, but that looked like that's been disabled. I'll have to look into that. However, I do want to point out that as you're maybe adding additional information to an existing model, if you do come through and add a check to any one of these here, you don't forget to expand on that object and then go through and tick off those particular elements underneath. Otherwise, they won't be represented in your map down the road. And in those instances where you map, and perhaps this is the source, and you actually receive a sample 850, and it didn't include any one of these the values in the subset that you define here, you'll just get a little warning about that. So that's also a good way to catch orders that contain information that you had not anticipated. So by creating the subset, it sort of creates a level of validation that you can use not only upon receiving data, but even when sending data. Otherwise, by default, all values are accepted, and whatever you get or whatever you create will be basically just pass through. So nice way to control the creation and the receipt of your data and validate against it. So that's an EDI trans. Yes.
Question: is this validation going to happen per segment or just at the beginning of the document? Or
At a
how does
segment
it
level. Yeah,
okay.
at each segment level as it's parsed.
And this say, well, are the errors, let's say, for example, if something does not happen, the validations, can we kind of personalize the exceptions or something like that?
Yeah, you can. When
Just
you
curious about it.
Yeah, you can actually create your own validations within a map, and it's more complex. This is just one layer that you can touch on,
Okay.
but you can do that. And the nice thing about creating your own level of validations is you can create what I refer to as a pre-parsing map. So I
Okay.
have one map that executes on incoming data. And all it does is it reads in what's received and it validates. Is this date the right format? Does this store exist? The store number exist in my database, etc. You can even go if you do it right, you can even create at the end this whole notification with all the errors in one big message. Otherwise, it'll tend to halt at each error, and then you have to fix, and then you run it again and then again and again. But I think the best way to do that is if you can capture all the errors at once and then set a flag. If any errors exist, then execute an email notification message that goes back to you with that information. Otherwise, if no error exists, then go ahead and pass it through to the translation map. So it's a nice way of managing your data before working it within a map itself. Sometimes you may just need to know what kind of data you're dealing, what kind of business document you're dealing with. Then you determine which map is appropriate for it, because you might have different maps for a cancellation order versus a standalone order versus a Mark IV order, all sorts of types. So yeah, you can use more than one map to act on the data itself. Definitely.
Okay, thank you.
We'll go back to the EDI document here. These are X12 structure files, definition files. I've never had the need to use these, but they do exist, and it would simply be a matter of pulling those in and defining the model itself. We'll see something like this when we look at an XML model. Then we have some predefined maps, and the nice thing about this is we can do a call onto a repository that we host in the cloud here, and it's going to give you just an archive, a library of models that we've built over the years related to various trading partners that we've worked with. So this is a nice way to start out. So if you happen to have a partner represented here, you can grab that partner and generate your own. Let's create a test file here. We'll dump it in. And so now we have this 810. So it was defined at one time per the specifications of AutoZone. I would encourage you though to look at the current specs because there's no telling how old this particular 810 model is. There may have been modifications to it over the years, but it's a good start to get you going. And then also with EDI related transactions, you can create a generic model from scratch. These are the standards we support. X12 is generally North America. At Effect is a more international. Tradicoms was basically in the UK. A lot of that was based in the UK, and HL7 is commonly used in healthcare. So once you choose your standard, you choose the dictionary. Again, all of this information you would have had to have received from your trading partner in order to understand what the need is. Then you just follow the prompts, and it's going to give you a blank slate to work from. And it's just a matter of manually going through, clicking on the segment and each element that's required, so on and so forth. So this idea of using a sample or a structured file or something from scratch is, you'll see, that continues through these document types. The next type you'll probably encounter most of the time is going to be a data file here, and this requires you to have a little more understanding of the structure of your data file because they can vary. Again, you can create something completely new from scratch, a little more effort involved, or if you happen to have a sample, that would be ideal. So I'm going to go here to my project resources, and number 2, I'm my structure, and let's look at the resources here, and here's the data file, and let's see, where is my sample here? Okay, I'll open that guy up. So my understanding then of the structure at a glance is that there's multiple record types, there's a header and a detail, and hopefully you have a little more documentation from the partner on this. But at a glance, we can glean here. We have a header, level, and detail, and we know that there are double quotes used to separate the strings or to define the strings, and then each actual data element is separated by a comma. So I go back to my model here. Oops, minimize that. So I'm going to say, choose the option here to parse through my sample. So I'm going to go back again to my number 2 Delta demo resources. Oops, I keep missing that. Samples, and there's my PO data file. Now, I know that the first line did not hold column name, so I can leave that unchecked. And you're going to see that with those CSV files that you see people create on their desktop all the time with that header record, and then the rest is a single records that follow. You're going to see those with CSVs. But in this case, that's not. But we do know that this has more than one record type represented in the data. So we definitely want to check that because that's going to create extra prompts as we click through this. I'm going to go to next, and right away, Delta has identified the first set of record types. There's our header and detail. Now it wants us to model accordingly. So I'm going to start to model the header first. Hit OK. Having parsed through the data, Delta is going to be helpful, and it's going to say, yes, I recognize there's commas that are separating, and there's double quotes used to identify the text or the strings. Perfect. I'm going to go to next. I know there's control line feed at the end that terminates each record. I'm going to go to next. Now here's a couple options that you have. You can either set a static location where this data is going to be read from or mapped to. This is map specific, and the downside to that is it becomes very difficult to determine within the ECS environment where this is. You have to open up, if you were to come new to this environment and you know some data was being translated but you didn't know where it was, you'd have to open up each map and look at each model and look to see if this information is defined. There may be an example in your own environment where you can't seem to find where the data is being mapped from or mapped to. I would suggest looking at the particular map that's executing at the time, opening up the model. It's probably been hard-coded there. The reason we do that is there are very rare cases where a user will execute maps via script. They don't have ECS installed, so they cannot integrate with ECS. So they really have to specify where am I gathering the data or where am I mapping the data to once the output is created. So that's really for those instances. 99.9% of the time, I would immediately go here. And this allows for dynamic setting of capturing data and delivering data, because all that will be configured in ECS. ECS, we will create an input channel to pick up, retrieve data from ECS, and then we'll create an output channel to take the result and send it out. ECS, upon capturing the data, will pass it to the map. We tell ECS which map to use. The map then, upon completion, is told where to deliver it, which channel to deliver it to. So anytime you can integrate with ECS, the better, because the visibility of it, when you go into, and when I say that, when you go into the data administrator, this is going to give you the visibility as far as where's data coming from, what's occurred, and where is the resulting output going. Otherwise, this information will not exist for you, quick reference wise. Having said that, now we have just a root object name. That's just referencing what's going to be the root object in the actual structure. when you're dealing with X12, the transaction set is automatically known, so it's set here. For data files, you'll need to tell Delta what you want to refer to it as. Right now, it's stealing the name of the actual file itself to do that. And then your character set is set by default. So when we go to next, then we have a simple table. Because again, the data file, there is no inherent dictionary that's defining this information. You're going to probably get a spreadsheet or a Word file from somebody that tells you what's going on. You got to at this point really go in here and key this all in. So let me go here and go back to our demo and our resources. And here's our PO data file specification. It's if you're following along, it's under, you can go to the desktop and you can go to the instructor files and number 2, Delta mapping demo and resources. And here's your PO data file specification. So this is going to give me all the information I need to know. If you recognize this, this is a printout of a model that we created ahead of time that represents this data. Here's my header. Here are the elements within the header. The first is a record type. So for me, I'm just going to, let's see, set this up here somewhat to the side. That is going to correspond to my field number 1. So I should have, what's this, total of 11 fields. If I look at my, where's my data here? Oops. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. The first is record type, so I'm going to double click and copy or Control C, and I know then to go straight to field number 1, drop that in there. As far as data type, I know it's a string based on my definition, my documentation of the data, so I can leave that as is. PO number, I'm going to go ahead and grab that. Set PO number, there's my string. Field number 3, we'll just do a couple of these. Here's PO date. Data type is date. Now here's the format. Month, day, year is set based on what was received. But you want to be careful because a lot of the time you're actually dealing with something along these lines where the double M represents a month with a 0 in its place. So there's going to be 2 characters here as far as the day, and then 2 characters for the year or 4 characters for the year. So setting the format's going to be important because when you map a date to a date, the format is done for you. You can override that. There are functions to override that, but it's set up for you. So you'd continue through this. You can even set your min and max width. That's really only important if the data file itself is fixed width. Then you have to have an additional piece of information that tells you how long is each field. But we know in this case it's all separated by a comma, so we didn't have to worry about that. So I'm just going to hit next here. We got through a little bit of that. This gives us then a representation of that first record. We can give it a name. We can actually literally call it header. You know, that could be header, summary, address, shipment, whatever the level we're at, whatever that record represents. It's nice to label that here. Next, we we told the mapper that we have identifiers here. We have separate records. So how is each record identified? Well, this drop down allows you to find the field because not every record type has the identifier in the first position. I've seen records where they can fall in the second or third position. So this gives you the flexibility to determine where in that record, which field contains the identifier for that record. Well, in this case, it is the first record. H is the character that represents the header. And then we're going to hit finish. Now, this is just a prompt that lets you know that you can ignore the identifiers, that Delta will manage them for you. So I always hit yes here. And I don't want to really build on that at this moment, so I'm going to hit no. And that's going to give me a representation of the root object being the file. This is the first record in the file. Here's the first field in that record, and so on and so forth. I can then come in here and continue by simply editing these particular elements and continue building out my message. Now these references here are really internal to Delta. So if you prefer purchase order number, you can go ahead and spell that out. These are just references from the specification, but there is no validation against the names that are sent. You can caption this any way you want to make it easier for you internally to do that. Now, I do know that there is an additional record type. There's a couple things to know though. So I want to create the detail record, and I know the detail record is going to loop. So best practice is to represent that detail record as a child to the header, because I know for every one header, I could have one or more detail records that relate to this header. Now I could insert that record type here, but it will become, if I insert the detail record here, it'll become a sibling to the header. Now that might not matter so much in the long run, but as far as best practice, at a glance, the idea here is to insert a new record type as a child to the header, and you'll see in a moment. We'll give this, let's say there's 6 here, continue. Again, you've seen this before. I'm going to go hit next. This record type here, this is going to be detail. In the first field is where we're going to find my record identifier. And I'm going to set D and hit finish. So you can see here, I have one file. Within one file, I can have multiple headers, and related to each header, I can have multiple detail. So this is the preferred method in order to structure a model so it properly represents the data you receive. Now, if I decide for one reason or another that I want this detail to actually be a sibling of the header, you can grab this, drag and drop it to data file, and it'll reorganize itself in such a way that we have the detail set here. And vice versa, I can take this, drag and drop it back and drop it into the header. Now, I do know that when you do this after you've created a map, it's going to jumble things around in the map. XML maps are much kinder. XML maps can reinterpret that pretty well, but any type of file type maps, to do this, it's best to accomplish the structure ahead of time, because after the fact it can be a little more complicated. You may end up having to recreate your map all over again. but just to point out, you can create additional, or you can move the structure around a bit. You can always create additional record types. If a new one comes along, you can insert a new record type. You can also create additional fields. There's our field, and we can give it uh, 12, let's say. New field 12, but perhaps it's embedded within the actual message. Maybe I forgot one. So I can actually go into the header, go to my order tab, and I can switch things up a bit. So again, I have flexibility to design this specifically to match with the data that I receive. All right, we'll go back to our creation here. I'm going to jump over to my desktop because we don't have an XML sample there, but I happen to have one I've been working on, so I thought it'd be nice to see this. So for XML documents, there are definition files, a DTD, document type definition, was the first type of definition file that was created to represent an XML transaction or an XML message. It's rare to see those now. What you're most likely going to get as far as definition files is an XSD, and an XSD is an XML formatted model of an XML message. So you're receiving XML in order to define XML. And schemas can be tricky. I find them to be hit or miss. Sometimes a schema will give you a complete organic message from top to bottom with all the definitions that you need there, and build it right out for you. Other times, partners will give you an XSD which actually represents separate elements, and you're then tasked to take each bit and build it out yourself. And that can be tedious, and it's not clear. And with XML, they won't really give you any documentation because they figure the XSD will do it for you. Well, it doesn't really, and a lot of time you're just dealing with somebody who's not familiar with how this all works. Also, you can receive an XSD which is just old and isn't current. So I find more often than not, the best thing to do is actually, especially with XML, is to get a sample. Get a sample of a transaction that they're actually exchanging, because that will give you a real life example of the nodes you need in order to build this out. So the same idea with the other. Oh, and also you can create a generic one, which I wouldn't encourage you to do again, because that can be very tedious. But you should have a sample. So I can go out here and let's see, where did I put my Delta program files? Let's do, I bet it's under resources, CLI. Nope, I'm gonna have to hunt for it. So here's my XML. So you can open that up. So here you can see the representation of an order. And you can see some meta tags here that represent, this is actually a representation of an X12. This is how this particular partner represents an X12 message as an XML message. So you'll see a lot of this similarities there. Then you have order header, the contents of that, payment terms, dates, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and incorporate that into the modeler for Delta, and very quickly it's parsed my sample and it's built out this model. Here's the meta header, line item summary. Let's just jump to the header because this might be a little more clear. I'm going to expand the header, and under the header I have order header, and under order header I have various elements. Trading partner ID, purchase order number, things that make sense to you as far as what might be in the header of a purchase order. But I'm going to expand this a bit because there is some overhead that you're going to notice with XML, because this represents the tag itself. So there's our purchase order number that represents the tag. You could potentially actually have a element within the tag itself. It clarifies, it helps to identify or describe the value here. So that information could potentially lie in between here. So we have this extra text tag because you just never know when this attribute might pop up and it needs to be inserted here. But this value here is represented by the value element here. So if you go through all of these here, every one of these elements has a value object, and you'll be mapping the value. Whereas you'll see in other, your data file, it feels like you're mapping the purchase order number, you're mapping the PO date. Here you're mapping value. The value does represent the purchase order number, but it is slightly different because it's really the contents of the tag, which is identified here. So it's just a little different, just to be aware of when you look at the maps, they'll appear differently. Now you do have, there are some XML message types that lend itself to this. When you have a complete document like this, you could go in here and you could create a sort of an overlay to this in order to identify information that corresponds with an X12 envelope. So this header here might relate to the document message itself. If you had something that represented a control number, receiver information, sender information, you could set these tags, these overlays, and essentially what you're doing is you're tricking ECS into thinking this is X12. Because if it's X12, ECS can do some things under the hood with X12 that it can't with other document types. It can do all that cross-referencing that recognizes this information in the trading partner manager, that in turn recognizes which maps to run for that partner. So it is a nice addition to XML that we can support. And that's, you might hear the term identity models, and that's what that is. It's these overlay that essentially teaches ECS how to recognize an XML document based on the EDF functionality that already exists under the hood. And one thing that happens, and if you might come across this from time to time, is let's say meta interchange control number corresponds to the envelope control number. You'll notice that it turns blue. So if you come across an XML model where you're wondering where that blue comes from, that is a good visual hint that this was part of a identity model. let's pop back over here. And then so on, we have additional model types. You have the JSON, which requires you to have a sample in order to build out in that case. And JSON is something we see rarely, but it's useful sometimes in web services. You'll see this message type there. Database access, this allows you to create a connection to or from a database. So you can read from tables and write to tables, and some of your maps may even do that. The only thing to note here is Delta is very good at parsing and reading in data. It's not as strong organizing data. So if you need to organize multiple tables in a database, I would recommend the best practice there is to create a view so that, let's say you're working with SQL Server database, create a view. So let SQL do the work of organizing that data and producing then the result of the view, which then we can interpret as a simple table. We can then simply read in the data from that table and generate the output as needed. There is some limited functionality where we can link tables together and we can add some query logic in there. But the more you do that, you're actually going to see translation slow down, and it can actually impact environments. And I've seen that happen. Doesn't start off that way, but over time, more and more traffic, more and more solutions, more and more maps, it will impact that. And we kind of have to then start over and re-architect things at that point. So I always tell people to begin with, always, maybe give us a call before you start a database translation map, and we can walk you through that. And then finally, we have that text type message. And I'm going to show you here a finished one. No, not that one, this one. Is that the report? Here it is. So in this case, we're using, the text can either be literal text, or you can actually incorporate the use of HTML. And what you're doing is you're creating blocks of information. And then within the block itself, you create a string. In this case, it's code. So you define the color, shape, and feel of the message. But then you can actually insert tokens. These tokens are what you map to. With these text messages, they're only good for creating output. You can't use them as a source because they're not really definable. They're just free form. But we can create these tokens. So report date and report subtitle are tokens that you would map to. So essentially you fill in the blanks with the text messages. Here's a body. Again, this could be HTML code. This could be an email message, a structured form letter, where all you're doing is you're filling in the blanks, inserting values here. So if we go, open this up, here the tokens will map to. And here, how are they represented within the code itself? So I don't know if I can run this map, but let's try it. This is an old one. See if we get some output. Yeah, here we go. So we have this title. We inserted, date and timestamp. This table is all HTML based, and all we're doing is we inserted the content. So very basic way to do this. Nice way to read from information that you can then share internally We see a lot of these types of reports just shared internally. It doesn't even have to be trading partner related. Just might be good for internal alerts, for example, notifying people of the status of certain message types or any validation issues that you might come across. All right, so once we have the components of our map, let's go ahead and open them. Let's do this. We'll go File, New, and we'll go to Map itself. And two things I want to point out in particular. We have the translation map option, which allows you to take a model to use as a source, a model to use as a target, and then you create a workspace to build that model. But the fact that you already have an existing environment, it's very likely that you're going to find a map that comes pretty close to meeting the requirements of any new trading partner that you onboard. So it's always good to look through your current library of maps, because you can use the map project option to make a copy of that map. And then you start with a completed map that you just need to go in and edit. You tweak it in order to meet the needs of your current partner. You never want to copy from the file system maps from one place to another, because I'm going to show you this. Let's go into the actual map itself. So here's the instructor map. Here we're taking the data file and creating an 850 message. If I open this guy up and let's see what we got. I wonder if I can use this guy here. What do I want to do with source? Let's just open up. Let's see. No, that won't do. Oh, where's our, yeah, this guy. So under the hood, the maps themselves are formatted in XML. But what I want to point out is that within the map itself contains pointers to the location where to find the source and target models themselves. There's your target. Being that this is hard-coded information, if you copy and paste this to another folder, you may think you've made a copy, but it's referencing back to the older models. And so if you start messing with models, you could be breaking other maps. You can even see here test data. Whenever you execute a map against test data, it's going to remember the last file you used. And this is really helpful. When you package up the map, it automatically packages up that sample data for you, and you can then zip it up and send it over for review. But even just when testing the map over and over, it remembers what you tested. So a lot of information is stored within the map itself. So you never want to take this and copy it and try to dump it into another folder, because it will break. It has a potential to break your other maps. So when you want to create a copy, you want to use the map project option. Otherwise, if you're creating something from scratch, you're using the translation map. A control map allows you to create, use a source model, but have no target. So here you're just parsing data, and then you're executing functions. And this is the opposite, where you don't have a source, but you have target. So this might just be a list of calls you're making to a database or something along those lines. So these exist, rare to use, but there's some use for them. So I'm going to go into the translation map. And right away, I'm asked, well, what's your source and what's your target? What do you want to do? What do you want to do here? So because of the way things are structured, I can get a sense of, where to go to find what I'm looking for. So I'm going to go under the instructor group. I'm going to go under Delta Mapping Demo, and I'm going to start with the purchase order source. And then I'm going to go back for my target in the dropdown, instructor to Delta Mapping Demo, this time EDI 850. So I'm going to start with data file and create X12. I can also use these buttons out here and go find them if they're not inside the structure, but they're more likely than not going to be here. I'm going to go to next. How am I going to deliver this data? Well, I'm generating X12, and if I know who the partner is, I've already set them up in Training Partner Manager, and I'm very likely tested communications with them, or at least started that process. So if it's Wiki Toys that I'm sending to, I know that the delivery is going to be out of a particular output channel, and I'm going to have a particular ID associated or format. So all that's already set up for me. So I can say just piggyback on the Training Partner Manager and let that do the work for me. I can also be very specific and control that in the map itself, and that'll be useful for things like XML and data files, which might not have that level of integration with the Training Partner Manager. But since I'm creating EDI, we're going to use the Training Partner Manager in this case, and then I'm simply going to choose which partner to work with here. So as the sender, I'm going to set Global Enterprise, and as the receiver, I'm going to set Wiki Toys. And then you can go next. It's going to generate a name for the map. It basically takes the source model and kind of concatenates it with the target model. So if you're really clever, if you name your models right, then it gives you your map name for you. And then you hit finish. Now it's going to give you this workspace. So now I'm in a position where I can begin to create those rules that are going to generate this X12 here. Depending on your settings, you may or may not have a prologue and epilogue section here. These are just set, and they're useful in that before the actual translation begins, you can execute rules here. And the reason you want to do that is maybe there is a step involved prior to translation. Maybe you need to gather global variables, or maybe you need to make a call to a database to execute a stored procedure. Maybe you're just setting some flags here. All part of maybe more complex solutions, but something that's available to use and maybe useful if you find yourself in a position where you're not quite sure what to do, but just to let you know, there's probably a way to do it. Again, that would be the point where you can reach out to us and we can help you through that. And then epilogue is just the opposite. After the map is done, after you've created data, you can set epilogue rules. Excuse me. So in the epilogue, you can set things such as, did this map execute without error? If it did, then proceed in some way. If not, then alert me in some way. This is helpful. I've seen this with databases. If you write to a simple table and something fails during that process, the data is not valid in some way, something breaks, you can back out of that table and not commit that information to it. So you can be notified of that kind of a thing. But for the most part, you'll be working really within these two areas. And to start, you'll be in your map, in your source, at your source level, determining how to begin to map your order. Now, if you're in a one-to-one situation where you know that the contents of this data file will only represent one order, then it wouldn't hurt to map it straight across. As soon as I make that connection here, you can see things sort of light up. This is bolded. I suddenly have a rule here inserted in between my prologue and epilogue. I have this create 850. So what happens here at create 850 is a couple things. I'm actually starting to build out the envelope information. I know who the sender and receiver are. I'm starting to prepare by creating, and this is all under the hood, creating this envelope information. Not quite ready to lay down the time, the date and time stamp, but it's ready to go. But that assumes that here, whatever's contained in this data represents one order, because that's all I'm creating here. I'm creating one order. However, we actually know that this data file contains more than one order. There's more than one header, so that each representing one order. So it's actually the header that I want to use to actually prompt the creation of my transaction. So the one-to-one relationship is not file to 850, it's actually the header to 850. So if I grab the header and drop it on 850, you can see I created a second rule. Well, I could have done a couple different things at this point. You know, I can take this rule number 2 and I can simply delete it. Or I could have gone into the map and I could have, with this right click, I can change the source node. And what this allows me to do is from within the rule, go back out to the source and toggle between where my source node lives. Again, change source node again, PO header. You can see the structure here. So when you name the file and then the record type, you can see how we build that out. So it gives you references to where you are. This sort of fully qualified name here. Now I'm going to jump down here and do this. I'm going to expand this. And here's my PO detail record. Now, before I do any of the stuff inside, I kind of want to just build out the sort of general framework. So I know each detail is going to correspond with the PO1. The PO1 is going to be where I can all of the line item information lives. So for me, I'm going to take the PO details and I'm going to map it to PO1. So I haven't done anything as far as building a transaction with data. I'm just simply building a framework to know at what point do I create the order, at what point do I create line item information. And this gives me a sense here, again, this fully qualified name. This is the PO data dot PO header record dot PO details record. So now I'm here at this level. And because I'm a child of the header, I can reference all this good stuff up here. So let's actually now look at what it looks like to map some data. I'm going to come here to the right, expand the BEG, and I know the BEG 02 is going to hold, excuse me, the 3 is going to hold the purchase order number. Well, here's the corresponding value here. So I can drag and drop and release. And suddenly I'm prompted with something here. What delta is saying is that when we model this, our BEGO1 was given a couple of options. We have the ability to create an original or cancellation transaction. Which one do we want to create? So we need to make that decision here. So this allows me to do so. I can double click on the 0, and you can see right here, I made one connection and I generated 4 different rules. Highlight those. I can go out here and use my little highlighter. What I did is I mapped the PO number, but because I had predefined SA as the value for BEGO2, Delta went ahead and laid that down. Because I had predefined in the model that the BEGO1 contains 00 or 01 or what have you, it also laid that down. And it forced me to make a choice, but it laid that down for me. And because the BEGO5 is mandatory, as all 4 of these are, it doesn't know what the date is, but it's going to lay down this rule for me in preparation. Because Delta's being helpful. It says, well, this is mandatory. You got to use it. So I'm going to go ahead and put this here and wait for you to actually populate the date. So I can do a couple things here. I can take the date of the order and map it to the BEGO5. And you can see that connection made here. Or I can use a built-in function because Delta has a series of functions. You go under the help menu and go to the function reference guide. If you get a chance, you can browse through these. A lot of them will be familiar to you if you're working within Windows environments and databases and such. You'll see a lot of functions that are familiar here. So we have those. We have our own custom ones. We have some. You actually have the ability to create your own custom function if you wanted to. This is the reference guide to what we have built in. And I just happen to know that there's a function called now. And if I key in now, open paren, close paren, that will then lay in the date at the moment of creation of this message. And that may be the more appropriate date to use here rather than an older date, which was used at the time of the creation of this file. Because I don't know, maybe this file was created in my ERP system yesterday. The actual 850 doesn't get run until tomorrow. So, you know, knowing things like understanding processes like that have implications as far as your mapping is concerned. Now, what I did here is I used a shortcut. I've got this values field. I also have this condition field. They represent the current rule that I'm on. As you can see, as I click through here, the information changes here. This is the value. This is the information that's getting written to the target. Conditionally, though, this allows me to set certain parameters to determine whether or not the rule is actually going to run. So, for example, I have this option here. The BEGO1 is equal to 00. Well, I know from my setup already that I had 2 options, 0001. I'm going to make a copy of this. I'm going to use just Control-C, Control-V immediately, one right after the other. And you can see I immediately created a copy of that rule and inserted it right in here. I can also right-click, do Insert Rule. I can use the Insert key on my keyboard. Various ways of doing the same thing. So now I've created 2 identical rules, but I want to change this rule here to a value of 0, 1. So now the question is, how do I determine which one executes? That requires a little more work. It doesn't really represent anything here on this side, but perhaps there could have been a field here that said PO status. Let's imagine that there was. So what I could do is I could lay in a condition here that if PO status was equal to, let's say it was a new N, that infers that it's a new order. That means 0, 0 is going to be, the appropriate solution. So my new order corresponds to original as far as X12 is concerned. As far as cancellation, perhaps we had a PO status equal to C. If that is the case, then we set the 0, 1. Now I can go ahead and come back up in here and key this in, or I can grab this, copy it, select this rule, paste it, and then simply go back in and update it. So you have the ability to copy, cut, paste. You can even select multiple and paste. You can copy rules. You can copy rules from one map to another map. So that could be helpful if we talked about creating copies of existing maps in your environment. You might get 50% of the way, but maybe there's code from other maps that would be helpful. As long as you have that map open side by side, you can copy from one map into another, and that once you get the hang of that, can really speed up development time. It's a lot of flexibility here. So I'm going to take this rule and I'm going to let's look at the properties that are available. So if you double click on this, you can see the rule set. Now, if you didn't follow along and if you want to start to do some of this, you can go into the instructor folder and go to the Delta demo, and there is a complete one here. You can open that up and you can click in with me on that. I'm going to use mine here because I want to be a little more hands-on. So I'm going to double click. So here's some general parameters here. This element tells me that this is what I'm mapping to, and this is the value of that. Now that value can, it can be literally what is found on the source side. I can manipulate that value. And if I go to this first tool here, this is my expression calculator or my expression builder. And this gives me a whole series of options here, something to sort of explore and learn about. But all the various functions I can use to take that particular code, and I can convert it. I can do some general adjustments to it. I can take a string and find something relevant within it. I can take a string that's broken up into delimiters and find a value within the delimitered space. I can take a date, time, and manipulate it. I can add 5 months to it, subtract 2 days from it. All sorts of things here to help you manipulate the data in order to produce the proper output. Constants here are something that you can build into yourself. Constants are constant throughout all your maps, and I find it rarely used. I mean, I can think of things, maybe if it's your company information, your company address could be a constant, or some sort of static piece of data that would be the same throughout all maps. But that's not often used itself. But you can use, conditional logic, use and or ors within your parameters. If such and such both equal true, then execute the rule. That's a great way to set certain conditions itself. Partner parameters, this is the area then that allows you to reference back into the trading partner manager. So here, because the trading partner manager really only binds with the EDI data, and in this case, the EDI data is represented in the target on the target side. So that's what this target represents here. Then we have the target sender and the target receiver. Well, we know the target receiver we set to be Wiki Toys. So within that target receiver, we have all these fields that we can gather from. There's our address information, contact information, name and email, all these tabs that we had talked about, contact, address, even under the general tab, these 5 custom fields here, we can call on them right here. Local ID 1, 2 through 5. So that's can set up very interesting conditions as well. You can set at a very high level. If you set a flag for condition, set, just set a flag for field number 3. If that flag exists, then maybe there's a whole subset of rules that run. Maybe there's a special cross-reference lookup that has to occur. That that you can set on the fly that way. A lot of creative things that you can do besides just simply pulling down existing values from the trading partner manager. Then you have your source elements. So I can kind of the long way around. I can actually pull data from the source. And here's my target. Here's where the data is going to land. And then I have a set of variables, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how to create your own variables. There's some built-in variables, and then there's EDI overrides. And the neat thing about overrides is they exist when you're creating X12. And this allows you to, remember when I said when we created this first rule, we create the 850, there's a lot of things that are prepared for the content. We're kind of preparing the envelope. Well, since we're in a place where that envelope is prepared, we can then override any of those fields. This allows you to control the sender receiver ID. That happens quite a bit. For Wiki Toys, maybe there's a certain division where you want this map to only send a certain ID. So this allows you to really control that at a granular level. You can even set the test flag, override the fact that you're sending a production message and set a test flag dynamically. So very powerful things that you can do with these overrides.
Is the override going to apply for example, if we declare it in the beginning of the map, is it going to have the same override all over the map?
The override is for this map.
Okay.
Yeah, just the map, not for the model, because you can use the same model over and over again if you wanted to. But yeah, for the map itself, it's laid in there for that override. And in fact, you can see that I actually had to do that for this map that I had to do for creating an 850. So in this case, I was taking XML that already happened to contain sender and receiver information. So Delta requires that I set the proper delivery settings, but I didn't want to actually use them. I wanted to use what was given to me to use from the source data. So I was able to use these overrides here. You can see they all start with an underscore, and I can set the value here.
Okay.
Yeah, so every time this map runs, this will be reading from the source and dropping the proper information there. So
okay.
Good stuff. Let's see. Oh, real quick then, this button here is simply giving you a little table where you can go through all of the functions that are available to you. And let's do left. It's simple. Here you have the parameter types, and here's where you can set the values, and here's where you have a little help to explain what's going on. So with left, it's going to give you the left number of characters that you define. So in a string, now this string doesn't literally have to be a string, it's more than likely going to be the source value. So this could be PO number, comma 6. So we'll give you only the first 6 characters from the left of that PO number. And this is another nice way to start to learn how to use functions to control values of things. We also can, so this represents simply data from the source that exists and how it's mapped to the target, but sometimes we want to include variables, and I'll show you how to do that. You'll notice down the bottom here on the left, we have this little variable directory. It's empty at the moment, but we want to start creating something. So let's create a variable that will count the number of line items in each record. But because we have multiple orders in one file, I need to make sure that I don't continue to add each one of those line items over and over again. Every time I hit a new order, I want to basically initialize it, set it to 0 for each order that I hit. So I'm going to start here at the header, represented here. I'm going to do an insert. In this case, I use my keyboard shortcut. I have an empty element. I'm tabbing through here. I have an empty element field. I'm going to set a variable. We'll just call it line count. And as a habit, I always use a lowercase v because at a glance, I can find in my maps where all the variables are. And then you can kind of come up with any name you want. Doesn't matter as long as it's helpful to you. So v line count, I'm going to initialize it to 0. And also as a little green icon here to represent that this is a variable. Something exists unique outside of the source and target. The next step then is I want to count that, but I want to count it per detail. So I'm going to set it down here. I'm going to actually insert here as well. You can see here where since I initialized it now, I have it represented here under variables. So if I hit this drop down and go to the bottom, there it is again. So now Delta's incorporated it into its environment. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to need to restate it. That's the important part. You need to restate the variable before you continue to act on it. So in this case, I'm going to restate it and then add 1 to it. And then hit enter. So here I've created the variable. We'll do this one in green and this guy green. Whoops. Okay. So I'm now counting this variable. Where might I want to put that? Let's do this. I'm going to expand my PO here. I have a PO 101. This is really, I'm just another reference, which I happen to know counts the line items on the X12 side. So the variable here, there's no variable. I could grab this variable and drop it here. And you can see where it lands. It's sort of out of context here, just because it's dropping it at the end. It doesn't really know where on the source side it came from because it isn't coming from the source. It's coming from within the map itself. So I always make sure to take things like this and place them correctly because I don't want to confuse myself. And that's what these controls allow you to do, is take your rules and manipulate them within the map itself. And there are when you want to make some adjustments. So here again, just to review, I've initialized a variable, created it from nothing, now represented here. I've then taken that and loaded the variable. I've now added this count feature to it. I've restated it, added 1, and now I'm unloading the variable. I'm going to place it in the PO101. So let's just go ahead and see what happens if we run this little fragment here. I'm going to do a map test. It's just basically telling me that it's not complete. I understand that. There's my sample file. And I know there's some errors to it, but let's see how far I got. Oh, there's BEG. Okay. Warning, terminated with errors. Well, let's look real close. This is good to give us a good opportunity to look at the diagnostic features here before we look at the result of our variable. So I'm going to raise this bar here a bit. I think we talked about this somewhat on the other side on Monday. But here it's telling me in red, this post status, it doesn't know what that is. It doesn't exist. Well, that's true because we were using that just for demo purposes. So I'm going to clean this up. I can simply disable the rule. And in this case, I want this rule, but I don't need that condition. So I'm going to back out. So I can grab it from here, from this condition area, backspace, give that a minute, and then hit enter. And you need to enter here because you need to commit the change. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run that again. See how far we can get. All right, this is as far as we need to get because the only thing I wanted to do is point out that the variable executed and I've got a 1 and I've got a 2 here. That's exactly what I needed it to do. Simply take a running count of line item numbers and then write it out here. I believe we touched on the diagnostics last time. That's really helpful for new users, new mappers, because it gives you a good way to learn how to read through a map. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the completed map. Again, that was found under the instructor Delta Map demo and the PO source DDI 50. So here's my completed map. I can either go to map properties, I can right click here, go to properties. And by default, these will be turned off. If you set your diagnostics though, and hit OK, then you'll be able to see the contents of the logging here. We had set a breakpoint last time. I'm going to remove that. Recall how we walked through that. And then we talked about a couple of tabs here. Some additional tabs to look at. The search is really helpful here because not only can I search the rule, but I can search this diagnostics here. Maybe there's a value I'm looking for. There's Andrew here. So I'm going to do a search in the diagnostic for Andrew. So in this case, I knew there was a value that was significant for some reason, But rather than having to comb through the entire diagnostics, I can use the search feature to do that for me. I could see where this value, where it was represented in the source. I can see where it was mapped to as well. Not only can I do that, of course, I can search the rules. I can even search in the models, target models and source models. And I've had to do that sometimes when I needed to determine if a model was current. An older model, I might need to have to update it, so I needed to check to make sure all the fields existed, and you know, maybe I couldn't find a particular field. I'll just use the search to confirm that it exists, or if it doesn't exist. And then the rest of these I think we touched on before with our breakpoints here. So I'm going to take these off and go ahead and go up here, hit the stop button, and rerun. There's our output. Now we don't have to have this open all the time. We can actually take the button off here, and so now when I execute it, I get to choose whether or not I want to open that. Oops, show output. That's what button I meant to hit. Nope, open output after. One of those was going to work. But the fact that I can have, rather than clearing the list, I could start to begin to gather the results of each map run, which is really interesting because now I can look at using my my control key. I can look at the output of two separate runs, right click, and do a compare. And for this guy, I think, is that it is HTML based. I can go Internet Explorer here. So what I've done is, if you recall, the first run here was of that map I created by hand. You could see where the variables were used to create 1 and 2. That was the little guy. This was the map run of the completed map. So side by side, I could compare any changes, deletions, additions, and this is a helpful tool for looking at the impact of a change that you might have to make. But in order to get to that point, you have to remove the checkbox here. Otherwise, if you click that, you only get one instance at a time. So you might not even realize that's available until the compare feature is available until you take the box, take off that box. Then you can get multiple instances. So after you've created a map and you've run tests against it, every time you execute, this is all works internally. These are all temporary files. It does not impact production. You then want to promote this to production. I think we talked about this last time, where you go to map and install, and that moves it to the ECS environment where you can then apply it and then work with it there. But one interesting aside is this is also helpful when testing with a training partner, and you find you might have to make a change to the map dynamically really quick, and get some more data back to the training partner. You can go to the tools menu and execute a test batch. What that allows you to do is execute a map in such a way that the output will deliver through ECS. So consider this a production run, but it's controllable. You can control which map to run. So this will only show those maps that are installed. And then you can choose the data to run. You know, maybe I've tweaked the data in order for it to produce the results that I'm looking for, that I can then send to the training partner. So with all that information in place, I can hit OK. And I've just executed a map in production We set this up before on Monday. So if I go here, I can find that output. In fact, if I go to C, and it was under ECS, data, output. Let's see. Let's do this. Today's the 15th. Local time is 8:46. And there's the resulting file that I just ran. So that's a nice feature. Again, because of the way this integrates with ECS, you have that control here. Just a couple notes here then. If you go under the tools menu, you have access to some of the other tools within the environment, such as the Training Partner Manager. You have an EDI dictionary viewer. This actually gives you a visibility to the dictionaries that are installed with the product. And all it does is just gives you the definitions for every segment and every element, and how they are used. And sometimes this is useful to verify, what you've been told, or to confirm that you're on the right path when creating your X12. It's a nice tool. On the rare occasion, you can edit a dictionary and save a copy of it under the hood and then bind it to a trading partner, because every once in a while, over the years, I found one partner who just created generally what's happened is they've created X12 using some sort of proprietary software. So it doesn't really legal X12. It varies from the dictionary. Now, our dictionaries are going to call that out, and it's going to cause an error, and it's going to refuse to generate bad X12. So in order to generate bad X12s, there's a couple things you can do, but one of the things you can do is create a custom dictionary that represents the bad X12 that partner is using. So you can kind of set it once and then forget about it, just knowing that the partner needs to use something that's out of the box there. You also have the data link manager, and here's where you would create configuration strings that point to the drivers that are installed by default in the Windows ODBC repository. Now, sometimes you want to communicate with a database that requires a unique driver. The only way to get to it is to install that driver locally. And sometimes it's a matter of installing maybe a client tool proprietary to that piece of software that connects to that database. You need to install that on the Windows server itself here so that it appears in this list so that you can use it, and then you can connect to it using your credentials and identifying the data source and then the correct table. So that's what you would need to do for database connections. There's a couple things I think we can skip over. I do want to point out the user-defined code table. This area allows you to create a table that lives within ECS, where you can set up a simple code pair. So upon receiving the value from your source, you can do an automatic conversion to the value that you need on the target side. This can be simply taking the unit of measure code that's sent and making sure it's the correct unit of measure code for your system. It could be a store number that's sent that's converted to the correct store number within your environment. I've seen this with part numbers as well. I've seen this with carrier information, a unit of measure. It could be quantity related. I've seen some conversions where you need to take maybe they're sending you a case and you need to convert it to comparable each or something like that. But it's a nice way. You can do one or two of these in the map itself. If A, then map B kind of thing. But if you anticipate you're going to get more than half a dozen of these, then rather than add too much noise to the map, it's nice just to put it up here. That maybe in the future you can always add to this. It's nice. It's a nice addition to keep things better organized. But it's also something that's not particularly visible when you first come in here. So if you open Delta in your environment there, we can look at the code tables. In fact, we'll do that on Friday. Is when we meet again. I'll ask one of you to host, whoever has permissions to look at your environment. If you have a test environment, that would be best. Okay. Tester development. If we need to, we could look at the production environment. We'll just be careful not to make any changes, but we can walk through your environment and maybe that will prompt questions from you as to what you're looking at. We can poke around the diagnostics. We can poke around the logs. We can look at some existing maps and we can start to infer what's going on there. Then after that, what we can do is, since you have training hours stored up, you can then, once you have more hands-on there, you can reach out to me. Either one of you or a team of you could say, we could just meet for custom training on whatever topic you're interested in at that point. Because with these trainings, I can give you a nice presentation and a nice sort of overview and introduce you to things. But until you're actually working in your own environment, there's really not, you probably really won't have the questions until after the fact. Well, the good news is you've got hours to then, we can do follow-up training on specific, questions you'll have. So very good. I guess one last thing that I can point out here is under the help menu, you do have this map snapshot, and what that does is it allows you to capture the contents of the map, zip it up, you can save it, and then you can send it over. You can send it over to me, you can send it over to support. It allows us then to then take the contents, set it up here ourselves, and run the map. And sometimes that's all it needs is for us to actually run it locally to help see what's going on. You can see that it contains your map itself with models, any constants that we set, any sort of data that we ran, trading partner records that we need in order to create that X12. So again, nice feature for troubleshooting and communicating with support for any issues.
Questions?
Yeah, so any questions you have?
Yeah, from the EDA tables you were talking about,
yes.
For example, to create a cross-reference, could that be something? Is there any other tool other than Delta to access it? For example, if we need a cross-reference to be maintained, can another user do it with other tool, or will be needing to have access to Delta?
Well, you can either set it up in Delta. The other option is you can go back to this data link manager. If you can build a data link to an existing database, and it would have to be a simple code table, you could then do that. You could actually, if you can create a link to any database and you're familiar with the query language of that database, you can create your own custom queries if you need to do that even. And taking the value, do cross-reference on the database itself, and then return a value which you can then add to the map. So it's pretty flexible as long as you can create a link to the data repository where all that information lives. And I can tell you, for the most part, a lot of people have SQL servers because they're easy to work with. And so I know we do this all the time with SQL Server. Not so much with Access. That's not so much, but definitely SQL.
Okay. And
yeah.
the other question would be, can the variables host, for example, nodes or let's say multiple? Can it be an array?
Yeah. I mean, that can, and if it would be nice if we found arrays used in your environment. I might have a couple maps on my computer that we could run. But yeah, there is a concept of an array. It's Delta specific, but you can build an array that will contain, think of it as a dynamically named variable that you define, you load, and then you unload later. But it requires specific architecture, a very specific approach to the map. So that's something that we can either look at Friday, or you and I could sit together on a separate call and look at examples that I have and show you, what that, how that can be done. So depending on whoever is interested,
Emmanuel. Here, Emmanuel.
Good. Anything else for today? All right. Well, thank you again for your time. Let's meet again Friday. And if one of you is able, let's plan to do a tour of your environment.
Okay.
And show me what you have there. And, I probably have lots of questions, and we can poke around and see what you have going. And
hey, Mark, I have one question.
Yeah.
I saw on the map properties we have converted illegal characters found in the strings and replaced that with the space.
Mm-hmm.
Can we replace that space with any other string or anything or something like that?
Yeah, now this particular setting is strictly for EDI. Is this what you're talking about?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so this is specifically for EDI, and it's related to, really what it's related to is the delimiters. A lot of the time, some people will in a text they'll type in an asterisk, a star, and it'll interfere with the actual code itself. So that's really what that's about. It's maintaining the structure of the X12 by eliminating characters that could also be used for terminator, segment terminators, or element separators.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we have ANSI characters like Japanese characters and things like that, that will work?
Yeah, that could be a challenge too, depending on what you're mapping. What a lot of people do is from ECS, they will go to the channel that's receiving the data. They'll go to the pipeline stage and convert character set. So if you can identify the character set you're receiving, you could, this is a good place to try to set it to another set. A lot of people can even do, you can get even more specific than that. You can do character conversions. So if you can anticipate a single character,
right.
Yeah, you can capture it and then convert it to something that you can translate and work with. You can either just remove it or replace it. So yeah, this is probably the better place to work with when you're dealing with actual data itself.
All right. Thank you.
Sure. All right. Well, then we'll meet again Friday, and we'll look at your side, and then we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thank you,
Right.
Mark.
All right. Thank you. We'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.